You're listening to What's Contemporary Now, a show about culture and the people, places, and things that together make it up.
Hi, this is Javon, your Blinds.com design consultant.
Oh, wow. A real person.
Yep, I'm here to help with everything from selecting the perfect window treatments to...
Well, I've got a complicated project.
No problem. I can even help schedule a professional measure and install. We can also send you samples fast and free.
I just might have to do more.
Whatever you need.
So the first room we're looking at is for...
Shop Blinds.com now and save up to 45% on select styles. Blinds.com. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Having just celebrated his first decade working in close collaboration with Rihanna on all things fashion, a few years more if you include the time spent assisting our past guest, Mel Ottenberg, Jahleel Weaver is still giving the doughy-eyed and dreamy endearment of someone new to the types of opportunity that resemble their own dreams coming true. When I asked him if he ever struggled with the pressure to perform, given the unavoidable scrutiny that comes along with that type of a gig, he told us that he avoids those kinds of pitfalls by keeping it about the work and not getting all that involved in how other people are going to receive it. Today we talk about having launched his creative studio, his other clients like Lipa and Taylor Russell, and discuss how he sees the culture through fashion.
This is Jahleel Weaver, and we're talking about what's contemporary now.
Jahleel Weaver, the first person in your family to be born in America, having grown up in the suburbs of Maryland, you didn't really have pre-existing models as far as people who had pursued the creative path as a profession. So let's talk about those early experiences and what that was like, or any early influences you might have had.
I grew up in Maryland. My family is from Panama, and they're Panamanian Jamaican. Everyone had a very normal job and a normal trajectory in terms of like their future. I always had a passion for music, for film, for fashion, for everything. I just was very visual as a kid. And I was very lucky that my mom just allowed me to fully lean into all of that and never forced me to do anything I didn't want to do. I would forego recess to just like stay home and draw. And when I was thinking about the woman and where she was going and what car was she driving and how was the setup of this picture that I was drawing in second grade. But I was just very visual as a kid, and it just was everything. It was a time of MTV. Everything was like so visual at that time. All those things definitely played a huge factor in how I became creative.
Do you remember any standout figures, be they musicians, supermodels, or people who held jobs that you thought you'd one day want to occupy?
Oh, absolutely. I think Madonna was definitely the first person I saw on TV that I was enamored by, and particularly her use of fashion in terms of each project and each identity and each musical era that she was going through. It was all so well calculated and well done, and fashion played such a huge part in it. I remember watching Truth or Dare and just being enamored by like, oh my God, Pedro Almodovar, like all of these things. Like she was just enriched in culture in the best ways. She had the best of the best. Thinking about who I work for now, she's the modern day, and it's the same sort of excitement I think that they both have and they both had, especially in the times when they were coming up. So it was super cool, but she was definitely one of the first in terms of fashion. I was a big Tom Ford fanatic. It was also like my first real star designer that I could put a face to the name, and it was so easily identifiable. The world that he created was so specific and it was so sexy, and I just loved it. So those were definitely some of the first. And also hip hop music. It was really cool because it was a time before you had like Genius, and you either like have the booklet or listen to the song on repeat to then write down the lyrics. And that's how I discovered a lot of designers, brands, stores, because it was all about showing off. You're dropping all these names, and a lot of which at 9 or 10, I would say, I wasn't very familiar with. So it was also like a huge tool. And it's very cool to now see my life be this intersection of music and fashion.
It's interesting to realize that your relationship to fashion has always been directly correlated to music and not sort of one before the other. But New York is also a pivotal moment for anyone that's moved to this city with the pursuit of success or dreams that come true. And obviously that's definitely a part of your story. But how did you first meet Mel Ottenberg?
I met Mel through a friend of mine, Lester Garcia, who was at the time, he was assisting, I believe, Maria Amelie, and he was just like fashion obsessed. I was very fortunate to make friends with him as early on in my New York life. And one day I went to him and I said, Lester, I think I finally want to give styling a try. I think it's just time. It was like post-recession, and I was interning at PR Consulting at the time, as well as working at Jeffrey. And I was just like, I think I just need to do it. And he was like, you should work with Mel. And I met with Mel on my last day of work. And 2 days later, he messaged me and said, hey, come work with me on a job. And at the end of that first week, he was like, by the way, I got Rihanna's Loud Tour and I would love for you to do some research for me. And that was it. That was the start of our working relationship.
Well, before we get into the Rihanna of it all, because that's obviously a very deep pocket to dive into, Mel himself is quite the character with his own impressive career. So what are some of the big takeaways you had with that time spent with him?
It was like such a time because his business grew overnight. So it was very cool to just be a part of it and to work with him and to see how he worked. He was very much like me, very image driven and very passionate about references and referencing the past, things from the past, things from the present to make something new. It was a very cool time for him and we had a blast. And I love Mel. He's a great guy and I've learned a lot.
I also feel like he's really good at supporting upcoming talent, which is always nice to see in someone as accomplished as him. So now going into the Rihanna sector, you've been with her since 2011, which is kind of crazy to think about because you still feel so new, so young, and that's a good chunk of time. But how would you describe the evolution of that relationship if you were to think of it as like key sort of express stops?
From 2011 to 2013 or 2014, I worked for Mel and I was a styling assistant. And then in 2014, Ree came to me and she's like, I want to start a company. And she started a company, Fenty Corp, to basically just house all of her creative projects. She's like, I have all these plans and I just want us to be able to like tackle everything from within. And at the time, maybe for the first 5 or 6 months or so, there wasn't anything. And I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing here. And then shortly thereafter, there was a Fenty Puma collaboration. There was Dior collaboration with eyewear. There was Manolo Blahnik collaboration. There was a collaboration with Chopard. There was the anti-album. It was just all overnight, just the craziest, probably like 3-4 years of my life. But it was a great time and invaluable lessons. Then after those 3-4 years, she is offered a house within LVMH to be the first woman to have a house, the first Black woman to have a house within the group. And I was the first employee. I moved to Paris. I was the deputy creative director of Fenty for the 4 or 5 years that we were operating. And then I came back and I became her full-time creative director.
Obviously, having worn both hats, where one requires you to think through the lens of an individual and the world you're building around them and what that messaging or communication looks like, and the other is pertaining to the sort of more holistic consideration of a brand in its entirety. How would you describe the different styles of thought that are required for each of those different roles? Because I'm assuming they're not the same.
For me, they actually are. I think because everything about me is so research driven, whether it's styling, the way I approach it, it's all based in some form of research. You know, it's an approach. It's never just at random. For me, it all kind of goes hand in hand and one lends itself to the other. I really see it as being kind of like a natural progression.
It's interesting because a lot of conversation is happening around the fact that so many people feel as though we can't necessarily make mistakes today because everything is recorded or everything lives forever on the internet, or everything is discoverable essentially. And that makes people much more self-conscious than we already were as a species historically. And yet you've actually spoken to the value of being given the chance to make mistakes as you grow and as you learn professionally. Do you think it's even possible to pursue one's dreams without facing failures along the way?
I think it's impossible. I think we all have to endure pain to see progression. It's just a part of the growing process. I don't think you can grow if you feel like there's not work to be done. I feel like for me, there's always work to be done. Every day is a learning curve, it's a learning opportunity. I can be a better boss. I can be a better partner. I can be a better son. There's always work to be done in some aspect of life. So I don't feel like anyone can really get to that next level of growth without enduring some sort of like failure or embarrassment, or it's just a part of it, but you grow from it and you come out with a better understanding of yourself and whatever circumstances.
Who taught you that wisdom?
My mom. My mom always had this saying, all they can say is no, all they can say is no. And it just gave me that fuel to just constantly like put myself out there and not be afraid to try, not be afraid to like take the step. Working with someone like Rihanna, who has been just instrumental in like giving me the space to grow and to think creatively in the biggest ways possible. There was no mistake. It was just like, yeah, we can do it better, but there's next time. There's always a next time. And I think those two women have been incredibly instrumental in like my thinking.
It's such a time to celebrate the relevance and significance of strong women in our lives. Do you feel like there have been any standout moments when it comes to learning from your mistakes so far?
Yes and no. Yes, without getting too detailed, but I think one lesson I learned, it was around the time where I started to style a bit more. And I never look at the internet. I never look at what people's comments are. One day I looked and it was so trivial, but it was one of those moments where like I should have just gone with my gut. And I always listen to my gut. And it was a moment where I wasn't necessarily happy with the outcome. And ever since then, I go with my gut. And because then I can't feel shoulda, coulda, woulda. It's like I did what I set out to do and I went for it. It worked or it didn't. But at least I don't have this doubt of what it could have been. And I think that once that happened, I feel very confident with anything I put forward, just to know that like how it's going to be received is how it's going to be received.
Artists have talked about that for years, right? The moment when it's time to let go of a particular project and put it out into the world, and you can't control what people are going to say or think and whether or not they'll love it or hate it. But what you're describing definitely seems to be a sort of winning hand to play. But you're also bringing up something really relevant, which is the internet, right? And I think it's got broad application across anybody's experience today, be they in public forums such as yourself or just a regular person keeping up with the Joneses. There's such a voyeuristic kind of monitored sense to life as it is today. And your role historically was one that would typically be found behind a camera. And yet you're obviously much more in public facing situations than perhaps in times past. Do you enjoy that? Is it fatiguing? Is it fueling? How does that work for you?
It's not something I think about, which I think helps. I think it's there. I think just because of the proximity to some of the people that I work with. In general, it's not something that I think stands in the way of me being me or me getting my work done, or like it's not a factor in my life, which I think helps. Once it becomes something that you acknowledge, you have to constantly acknowledge it. So if you just don't, then you don't have anything to worry about. And so that's how I feel. I still feel very much behind the camera. I don't know how realistic that is, but that's how I feel and that's how I operate. And it works for me.
What I'm hearing is that you're about the work and the rest kind of falls by the wayside versus falling prey to.
Exactly.
Yeah. Love that.
I just want it to be about the work. I want the work to speak for itself. And I don't want to have to say anything. Love doing this podcast stuff. In general, I would love for the work to just speak for itself and to not have to say anything. I think I want the work to live on past me and to be those cultural moments that we're talking about now, but in the future, that's all I want.
You're definitely making memorable work. I mean, let's be real. If you look at fashion's history when it comes to something like music, pre the 90s, they weren't really meeting at any particular intersection. They were two very separate pillars within the cultural fabric. And we saw that incredible convergence. And in more recent times, I feel like the work that you've done with Rihanna or what Law has done with Zendaya has very much brought that marriage to new heights in terms of the role played by fashion when it comes to stars and entertainment. But some actually say celebrity endorsement now overshadows the work itself when it comes to measuring a brand's success. And I wanted to hear what you thought of that.
That's a tricky question because I think being on the outside of it rather than inside, I actually don't see how it can overshadow. I think when the pairing is right, when it seems authentic and it seems great and it seems like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense, it can only help. And I think there's so many amazing designers. I don't see how a celebrity could really overshadow what's already great. I think when it's great, it's great. And, like what Law does with Zendaya is amazing. I think it's always the right choice. It's the right pairing. And I think I approach it the same way with Rihanna. It has to make sense and it has to be for a reason. So when it's right, it's just right. And I don't think that's something that hinders the process or how people perceive the brand per se.
Something else that's also come up is this idea that fashion's become too popular for its own good. And obviously, it's definitely a much bigger business today than it's ever been. And it's such a huge part of culture that some call it the ultimate Trojan horse. But do you think it's actually gotten too popular for its own good?
That's like a double whammy for me, because in one respect, I'm super happy for this generation who has the access with the internet and with social media. You can find out about the business you love, the industry you love, the people you love, the players and their stories in real time and really have a proper understanding. That being said, when I was growing up, it was pre-internet, or the internet was starting to become big in the late 90s, but you really had to search it out. If you wanted to work in fashion, you had to be passionate because it wasn't in your face every day. It wasn't something that was easily accessible for any of us, particularly someone who lived in Maryland in the suburbs. We really had to love it. And now I feel like too many people can love it without the passion. But I think people kind of confuse the two, having admiration versus having the passion to work in the industry. And I think those two things are very different.
They really are. Very well said. I mean, everything has both sides of a coin, right? You're touching upon a lot of things that are observations of the culture as it stands today. And obviously your work very much exists at that intersection where fashion, culture, lifestyle, or even things like body image meet. So what role would you say culture plays in both your personal and professional lives?
Culture is intersectional. I was raised by a Panamanian Jamaican family, first to be born in America, and I was going to school, and what I was experiencing at home versus what I was experiencing in school was very different. The music I was exposed to, the way that people dressed, it was all so different. And it's been really great to have all these cultures be of influence to me in one way or another, whether it's personal, whether it's professional, but I think it all intertwines and connects at some point. And to have worked with someone like Ree, who's also a Caribbean person, and what her culture is like. And there's always this place where we all meet. And I remember doing my first research for Mel, and I referenced like a dance hall artist, Patra. And Mel called me, "Oh my God, you referenced Patra. I'm from DC." And I'm like, "I'm from DC. I'm from Maryland." And like we had this connection over something that who thought that would be the thing. But it's definitely just always a part of, I think it's a part of everything that I do, honestly, in some form.
Well, it's sort of inextricably tethered to creativity, right? That's why I wanted to ask that question, just because I think some people appear to work more in a silo when it comes to the nature of their work, be that stylistically, photographically, design, whatever, whereas others very palpably seem to be engaging with cultural discourse. And I feel like that's obviously the whole reason this show exists in terms of the types of conversations that we're looking to have with people such as yourself. And I know it's cliche to talk about comfort being the enemy of growth, but you made a really interesting comment years ago when you and Rihanna were being interviewed, where you talked about the sort of jovial love-hate of that dynamic, because each time you felt confident in grasping, her thing and knowing her, she would surprise you. And I was curious as to whether or not those collaborations have sort of become familiar in their flow states, or if you still really enjoy that nature of surprise together.
No, I look forward to it, because I also want to be pushed. I'm happy to push, but I also love the push from my clients or from her specifically. She's such a chameleon, and we're very alike in the way that we get bored with something very quickly and on to the next. And she's someone who's done so much visually, within fashion. She's always looking for new starting points. And it really just helps us stay in tune with ourselves, in tune with what's happening next and where to go from there. But I love that about her. And it's still the same. I feel like, okay, yeah, I know she's going to want this. This one is the one she's going to go for. And then she's like, actually, no, I feel like it's this. And you're like, what? But like, I've known you for 13 years. But it's that challenge that I think keeps us both very engaged.
We're talking about things like culture. Another aspect of culture that I'm personally obsessed with at the moment is, of course, time. The observation of what speeds it up, what slows it down. Sometimes it can feel like we're living in the days of future past, which of course, literally we are. But if you actually look around and you think, wow, there are robots talking to people, and you can't help but sort of see how much of what is won't be in the not so far off future. But what's your relationship to time as someone who navigates it every day as a creative?
Time is like one day at a time for me. It's like one foot in front of the next, just like get through the day. Honestly, it's not something I really think about, which could be a good thing. It could be a bad thing. But I think without giving myself any sort of like constraints, it allows me to just go at the pace that I feel is right. I try not to put a timeline on it because I don't want it to feel rushed. They always say like jack of all trades, master of none. I never want to be that person. So I allow myself that grace to fully absorb into whatever space I'm in or whatever section of my career I'm in at that moment, to just really like take it and move when the time is right for me.
It's an interesting time to bring that quote up as far as a jack of all trades, a master of none, because there's so much discourse around the idea of being a generalist versus a specialist. And we now inevitably know that regardless of your career choice, we live in a time that's evolving so fast. The continued demand of acquiring new skill sets is inevitable for anyone. You've seemingly organically iterated already within the span of your time working within this industry. So I was curious as to whether or not you find that idea of constant iteration daunting or exciting, or
I find it exciting, because I know there's so many other things that I can think about already that I would love to accomplish in my life. That is not necessarily things that I've done already. It's just like a different part of the puzzle. I want to one day be able to say, like, I put every piece of the puzzle together. Like, I can do every piece. And I'm not there yet, but there are definitely so many other things that I would love to accomplish. And when you're a visual person, it tends not to just stay in one area. It's not just fashion where you have a visual aesthetic or an opinion. It goes into staging. It goes into, so many other things that I think a strong visual identity plays a big role. So I have many things that I'd love to accomplish in the future. I haven't even scratched the surface.
Well, let's talk about the studio. I mean, that's exciting and that's new from this year.
It started because I was on my 10-year with Rhi, and I just felt like it was now or never. As she built a family and family became, focus, I knew that there were still things that I wanted to do and that I haven't done. And I just wanted to be able to have, a group of kids, all of us working together and just doing all these projects that, might not present themselves otherwise. Again, to build onto the dream of that puzzle. That's what the studio is to continue to build the different roles to put that puzzle together completely myself.
And what role would you describe fashion as having in culture today? I feel like you're the perfect person to ask that question.
Wow. I mean, that's a big question. I think it's playing the same role. I don't think it's changed much. The audience is much larger, so it seems like it's a bigger thing, but it's always gone hand in hand. It's always played a part in any musician's life or any actress's career. It just is. But I think now we have a larger stage. But for me, it's the same.
Well, it's a perfect segue into our last and final question, which we, of course, have to ask. And that is, what is contemporary now?
I think now is contemporary. Just honestly, I think it's just the now. There's so much to focus on in the past, too much to think about for the future. I think now has to be now. It has to be present. It has to be in the moment. And I think that's the most contemporary thing.
The power of now. Thank you, Jahleel.
the power of now.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of What's Contemporary Now. A special thanks to our producer, Sasha Grinblatt. Audio post-production by Chase Coughlin with original theme music by Joseph Topmiller and Chase Coughlin of The Black Soft. And visual design by Aaron Meager and Graham Prentice. Subscribe now to be the first to catch new episodes each week. And if you've enjoyed listening, we'd love to hear from you. Leave us a review and let us know your thoughts. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for additional content and join the conversation. Let us know what you think is contemporary now.